convidado especial dessa edição.
You have a windsock. I do. No.
Brazilian.
I love it.
Brazilian style. Tem que falar é o artista e não o produtor, tá bom? Meus queridos amigos, meu querido amigo Ron Mann.
Thank you for coming, and I wanted to thank Alicia and In-Edit for having me here, and Lucy to translate.
Agradeço pela presença de todos e agradeço também ao produtor.
For being an icon of counterculture, for standing against, all the main media stream and documenting, the changes in the culture. That was looking through your work, and it looks to me like you're a man with a mission.
I became a filmmaker because I was a fan of music and a fan of comic books, and I had a mentor. His name was Emile D'Antonio, and he said there are only two reasons to make movies. You either love something intensely or you dislike something intensely, which applies to life. And I chose subjects that I loved. I was a jazz freak. I was a poetry nerd, and I didn't have a plan. I just kind of felt a responsibility in the 1980s when Reagan became the president of the United States, and kind of wanted to rewrite the 60s and dismiss all the progressive movements that happened out of the 1960s, but the real trajectory for me had, outside of making, just films as a hobby.
This is Ron Mann, a 23-year-old filmmaker from Toronto whose film Imagine the Sound recently won Best Feature Documentary at the Chicago Film Festival. The film celebrates the great improvisational jazz artists of the 1960s.
I saw Rahsaan Kirk, and he had a stroke, and he was playing with half of his body, and I thought I was witnessing a miracle, and wanted to document it. And 6 months later, he died. And I remember being a jazz fan, I listened to Eric Dolphy, and on one of the albums, it was called Last Dates, he said, music is in the air and it's gone. And I thought about that in terms of the ephemeral nature of our culture, that if you didn't record it, it didn't happen. And I felt a responsibility to record an alternative history. And I started with Rahsaan, and 6 months later he passed. I wanted to do Gil Evans, and then he had passed away, and I thought it was me. And then I had an opportunity. I had made a number of short films. I started making films when I was 16, and feature films when I was really super young. I was really weird. Every film is different that I...
Todos os filmes são diferentes, todos têm um approach, uma abordagem diferente.
I'm a music person.
Eu sou uma pessoa da música.
I can't live without music.
Eu não consigo viver sem música.
How Brazil has influenced your decision.
Well, yeah, no, that's very relevant, because when I was 16, I made my feature. When I was 15, I went to Rio. And when I went to Rio, I had gone on a vacation with my parents. Nobody wanted to hang out with their parents, so I hung out in the basement with musicians, a band, in the basement of the Sheraton Hotel in Rio, and I asked them how they got their gig, and they said, well, the Sheraton Corporation pays them to go to resorts around the world, and I thought that would be an amazing job. And I was in a band, and he gave me the person to call or to write at the Sheridan Corporation, and a week later I got back a reply with the cassette that I had sent them and a note that said, "Ron, we love your music, but you have to be 21 to play bars." And so that was the end of my career as a musician, I was never really that good, I have to say. I mean, my fellow band members were really great, and but I had started making films, just amateur films, and I treat everything as if it's an amateur film, by the way. Like, it's all new, I just have an view of every project as from an amateur's point of view. And to me, that's where it's still pleasurable. If I have to be doing the same thing, I will be, which is very much like jazz, which is what I is my music, and improvisation, specifically improvisational music. When I was 16, I worked in a record store. I used the money that I saved up from working in that record store to make a feature film.
Tell us the story how you smashed the record against the wall, you end up in the jazz section, and that changed your perception of music.
Well, firstly, when I was 15, I mean, the thing about being in a band was to, all the girls were paying attention to you, because I was really a nerdy, shy guy, and so giving up that, I for film was kind of interesting, because I started making these films and I started showing them in my class, and the girls were noticing. So I thought, okay, I can become a filmmaker out of this. While I was 15, I was working in a record store. Actually, I started working when I was 13 because my brother had a job there. And it was this record store, people have to remember the context of record stores. This is before the internet. If you wanted music, you went to the record store. And this was it was vinyl. And young people who came through those doors, and it was really exciting. And I worked the pop section, the ground floor, and it was the winter that I remember that Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon was released. I think it was also Band on the Run, McCartney, and maybe even Elton John, Yellow Brick Road. I'm not sure if it was the same year. But I do remember them pushing Dark Side of the Moon by playing it over and over and over. So you go to the record store and people would hear Dark Side of the Moon and buy Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon. And it drove, when you heard it, if you walked through the door, you spend 10 minutes listening to Pink Floyd, and that was great. But if you were working there, it was a full-on, you just couldn't stand it anymore. So I picked up the record from the turntable and threw it against the wall, and that got me fired instantly. And the next day, the manager he liked me, and he said, "Why don't you chill out in the jazz department?" And so I went up to the jazz department and started to listen to jazz, which was my introduction to jazz. And the first album that I listened to was Albert Ayler's Spirits Rejoice. And it blew my mind in more ways than Pink Floyd could ever. And I became was so, it was so, I wanted to know about more about improvised music and what was this. And so it was, and nobody went to the jazz department. And it's also where world music was, including Brazilian music, which was up there. And nobody went up there. And it was me, and I was cracking open these albums to listen to. So that's how I got my education in the music.
Say that like this job at the record store did for you roughly what the job at the video store did for Tarantino, for instance.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Absolutely. And I became a fan. And that brings you to my concert at Russell and Kirk. I mean, whether I saw Anthony Brown, I was very fortunate because Bill Smith and John Norris was in Toronto, and they published a magazine called Coda, and they ran the Jazz Blues Center, which was a record store. It was different than the record store. I worked at Sam the Record Man. They had a specific jazz store, and I used to go over there. But they were promoters of jazz, everything jazz, like music, live concerts in Toronto, along with Gary Topp, who was had a club in Toronto that would bring in jazz music as well. We were just really fortunate to be at a time in the 1970s where also jazz was kind of changing. You know, Herbie Hancock was doing like, suddenly electronic stuff. And I actually walked out of the Herbie Hancock concert because I thought, like, what the fuck is this? And I walked out of a Herbie Hancock concert because I thought it's like Bob Dylan's going electric. It's terrible. It's really bad. I don't believe I did that. But and then I was into it. It's like, oh yeah, Jeff Beck is doing like Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. It's like, wow. So the fusion era was kind of my thing, but I was listening to the evolution of the music and improvised music, especially Cecil Taylor, Archie Shepp, Bill Dixon, and Paul Bley. Now, Bill Dixon was involved with what's called the October Revolution concerts in the early 60s, which was kind of the center for me of the improvised music in the loft scene in New York. And I talked to Bill Smith about making a movie ultimately.
It seems to me what music is everything that you do.
You have this thing about documenting the evolution of the culture environment, the cultural scenario, and all those great idols that talk to your heart. There was either like the writers, poetry,
Sure.
music, cinema, film about Altman, and even mushrooms, like every aspect of art. So give me a little bit more about this.
I'm a suburban kid who was locked up in his suburban house, and the music spoke to me, and the music ranged from pop songs of the time to Ornette Coleman, and I'm reading Jack Kerouac, I'm reading Henry Miller when I'm 14 years old, and it's talking to me. And my peers are not. They're thinking, and I'm watching movies that Gary Topp at the Roxy Cinema was playing that were with Jodorowsky or Preston Sturgis or whoever it was. It was Richard Lester. They were iconoclastic, and they were my, and I was reading comic books like Mad Magazine, and Mad Magazine really kind of said, question authority. And so as a young person, I identified with poetry and the literature and the music and the films that were sustenance. They were saying that there was a world out there that is yours to discover, and it's full of adventure. So I hitchhiked. This is a time when you could stick out your thumb and people trusted you and you trusted them, and they picked you up and you would have adventures. And I went out to discover the worlds like Jack Kerouac, and I listened to the muse that I was given by all the books that I had absorbed. I was a kid in grade 10 who wrote on the wall 20 years of school and they put you on the day shift, Bob Dylan's line, and the homeroom teacher would point at me and say, "Man, out." And I would be in the hallway and I'd go to the library. They'd kick out this fucked up student, another fucked up student, and he became a cop. And but I was like the guy who just, thank you. I don't want to learn your, and I was reading Ken Kesey, and I was reading all about the world as it was. And I also was very fortunate because my brother was older and he was in a band and he was a drug dealer. And it was like, and he went to Woodstock. It's like, okay, I'm just like, I was listening to Bob Dylan. I was listening to the Fugs. I was listening to Moby Grape. I was listening to Jimi Hendrix. At the time that these artists were making the most incredible music for people the same age.
Saying that you have the best job in the world because
I got to meet my heroes. I got to meet Sam Phillips. I got to interview Frank Zappa. I got to meet John Cage. I spent like a day with John Cage in his apartment, baking zucchini loaf. I mean, it's like, I can't even describe my life. It's like insane how privileged I am to have learned from my heroes. And it's the best job in the world because I had the opportunity to learn and to have the and be able to amplify what I've learned. And I did have, you asked me about not the responsibility, but that I had documented alternative culture. Like, why? Like, what's the necessity of it? It's because the status quo is what we get all the time. We don't get the history of we get the history according to the media, corporate media. We don't get it from the kind of ground up. And if you change the channel on your television, all 500 channels, you're getting the same consensus. So the history of our cultural history, because I see myself as a cultural historian more than I see myself as a filmmaker. I wanted to document the alternative movements before they disappeared, so the artists could the Take a Tip Twist, which played last night at In-Edit. If Dick Clark had created a history of rock and roll dance, it would be in his perspective of it. It would certainly not include, I don't believe for a second it would include acknowledge how much Black culture had impacted on the music.
twist. You do a heavy use of archive found footage. That's an amazing work of, like finding amazing footage and do a collage, a really intense and vivid collage of amazing footage together.
Yeah.
And how was your research process? Where had you found all of this? And who owns it now? Is it accessible to public?
So collage filmmaking, for me was inspired by Emile D'Antonio starting with Point of Order, which is a film about the McCarthy hearings. And he used hours and hours and hours of outtakes from CBS's, the Army McCarthy hearings. Now, Deese once said to me, history is in the outtakes of television. And that's where the truth lies. And I went into the archives through a friend at the time, Rick Pralinger. Rick was kind of like, he was an archivist, cultural historian, and someone who gathered ephemeral culture that included like commercials and educational films that, were done to brainwash kids. And I became friends with many of the archivists through Rick. And this was film, by the way. It's not like today where you Google something, it's on YouTube. It's like, oh, okay. So, which is kind of remarkable in one way, but it's not, because old school was you went to the library, you had cards, you went through the cards and you went and you used keywords. And that's what I did. And I did my own research. All of it. Oh, a year. That movie took 3 years, and comic book took 3 years, and Grass took 3 years, and Twist took 3 years. And it's because I had to write the story. And it was a 35 millimeters. So you had cans. This was an expensive thing. And I remember we were editing a 35. And it was a 35 film. It was so freaking expensive.
Your cinematographer is 8 years old now.
Yeah, so that was Bob Fresco. And I was very lucky to have Bob and David Joliet and later on Robert Kennedy and Keith Elliott as being, in my band, because I see like these friends of mine that I create. It's a collaborative effort, and they make me look good. Bob was he was a filmmaker, and I learned a shitload from Bob. And I would trust, I was super young, and I was able to bring together an incredible, talented group of people who were dedicated to the same idea that I had presented, and they were able to beautiful image. I'll give you an example. This is like one specific example. I'm filming Tom Waits, and this is Bob Fresco, and it's in a Vietnamese restaurant in Los Angeles. And Bob, the sun is setting, and somehow it's one take. And Tom, who we've never heard the song, and it's never been on any album before or since, and somehow the lighting and Bob intuitively can feel the music and the performance, and it's perfect. Now, this is before video, where you don't have a video monitor, you can't see what it is, but you just can feel it, and it's this choreography that is just instinctual. And I was able to find cinematographers. I mean, I started with cinematography, but then I was able to find real artists who I was working with, who were like in my band. Now, at the same time for that movie, I had filmed Charles Bukowski. And Charles Bukowski was a 3-hour interview over I don't know how many bottles of wine. But by the end of the 3 hours, 4 hours of dinner with Hank, Bob was like taking the camera and just kind of like going all over the place. So I'm glad I'm drinking the wine and you're not. But it's like, you know, there were moments where my friend Peter Metler, who was, I come out of a scene in Toronto called the Toronto New Wave, and there were like Adam McGowan and Bruce McDonald and Trisha Rosemont. We all worked on each other's movies, and it was kind of like this collective and really young people who were just kind of we all went in different directions, but we were all just young. And but Pete Metler said, it's a spiritual thing. You know, when we were editing, it was like, that's the magic frame. Like, it was tactile. Film was tactile. And when you turned on the camera, it was like, if it was a still, it was like, it was spiritual. And so it was a very, going back almost to Spirits Rejoice with Albert Eiler, it was like this moment of, that you're capturing that is, I don't know how to explain it, except that it is it's a magical thing, and it's a spiritual thing, ultimately. And if you treat it as that, it's transcendent. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the subject just, like on Poetry in Motion, some performances were great, and the poetry is horrible, or the poetry was great and the performance is horrible. And I made a film about Bob Altman, and Bob said, film will inform you what the film is. And I kind of have that organic sense of approaching. It's clear minds. It's not presupposing. Once you presuppose, it's dead. That's really, so the spontaneity, everything I've learned from jazz is what I believe in, because it is there is nothing wrong, but it's just, there is something about the, when you are, one of the best interviews I did was with Sam Phillips, and it was 6 months before he died. This was Sun Records. He was Elvis's, discovered Elvis Presley. And it was 3 hours and he just wanted to talk. He just kept talking, like me, just kept talking. And, but it's like, I'm like, holy shit. And it was like a moment that I just captured before he had passed away, that also, and then it was the last person interviewed, Ken Kesey. It was just like you are given this gift, perfect moment.
But you have an approach to your filming crew that's pretty much an approach to a band, isn't it? Like, you run your filming crew as a band.
Well, when I was 15, I was in a band, and I wanted to replicate that in film. And so I kind of didn't know. I read Lenny Lipton's book on how to make, like it's not anybody can do. It's like not. But I read a book, and I took one class on how to shoot a camera, and then I started making movies. And so Lenny Lipton wrote this book, and then I became versed in everything that was cinema. And
But when you filmed Imagine the Sound, you had, and I loved it, because you filmed in the studio with mirrors in the background. And those are usually like a nightmare for a camera crew. But you have such a loose approach. I can see the camera crew most of the time.
Well, that's D'Antonio. D'Antonio made a movie called Underground, and that was about involving the subjects, and it was about authenticity, and everyone was a participant. And so that was replicated. That was in my mind theoretically. in an interview with Cecil Taylor and with Bill Dixon. I kind of appreciate it now because I can see myself when I was like 20, making this movie. But you'll see it also at the very end of Poetry in Motion, which is a long shot of Jim Carroll in a studio. And I placed artists in the studio because I wanted control over. It had to do with the respect for musicians, to have them in a sound and a studio that would, because prior to that, jazz movies were shot in what Cecil Taylor called the dungeon cafes, and they were shaky cameras and grainy. And I wanted to treat the musicians with the respect of a Hollywood film. And so I crafted the film with an art director in a studio where it was 24 tracks, Bill Sheridan's studio, and for the respect of the musicians and for posterity as well. I was very fortunate because I was just out of college. I'll tell you a crazy story with Paul Bley, just to show you how, I didn't know anything except love the music. So the first time I'm filming Paul Bley, first musician, and he finishes his piece, and I yell, "Cut." And Paul walks over to me, takes me aside and said, "Ron, just wait a beat. And because music's in the air and you got to let it just kind of breathe." And that's why in Imagine the Sound, you have these very long pauses at the very end of a piece to just kind of that moment where the music is still hovering in the air.
A jazz musician is a social category.
Of everything, quite frankly. It's like, what's not there? We were in a gallery today in Sao Paulo, photography gallery, and there's a show, and they positioned this image lower, not at eye level, but lower level of lower torso, like so and the white wall above it, and it was about the negative space, like you imagine what the bodies were like, and it was so it's something that is you're aware of, whether it's a Japanese sort of notion of or what I learned from my mentors, John Cage in particular, and it is absolutely what's around us, and paying attention for sure.
Hey, look who's here.
Rick.
Hey, Jim.
You got any guitars for sale?
Yeah, we got a few.
About attention, you have a love for the handcraft, for the master crafter that either does music, poetry, or writing. And I want to talk about Carmen Street Guitars. Amazing documentary. And
What does it say there?
184 Bowery, 1865, White Pine.
I call it the bones of old New York.
Hear it? Feels comfortable.
Good splinter guitar.
as well, I heard you saying that you've done a lot of movies a lot of films about music, about musicians, but this was your first film about music. So can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Well, Mark Ribot talks about the music as not just what you hear, but the whole body of how it happened. And that includes, the recording, the practicing of it, the community of music, and it's an it's a cosmology, I should say, and that's what I intended to mean about music, because it's holistic. It's a holistic view of music, but that is Carmine Street Guitars is a film that was about we're moving forward so fast in changing. It's sort of looking back. It's sort of saying, wait a minute, this is what we're losing in the acceleration of culture. This is what we're losing, and we're losing it just simply by the expense of the real estate gentrification that is happening. It's at least in Greenwich Village, which has become a completely different world than it was in the 1950s or 60s. I'm not nostalgic for it, by the way. I actually believe that it's change happens, and you could be nostalgic for Walt Whitman in the 1920s. You could be nostalgic for Jack Kerouac in the 50s, Jimi Hendrix in the 50s, who lived in Greenwich Village. So it depends on your point of view, but it's just to acknowledge the artisanal work that were just there were 6 guitar builders on Carmine Street Guitars. Rick was the last, and it's wistful. At the same time, it thrives because you can't stop this. Art won't stop because it'll just move. It'll evolve.
I'll take one.
All right.
I don't know anybody like you. You don't have a cell phone. You don't have the internet at your house. You need to move into the 21st century already.
Why? An old tree and turned into a building and turned into a guitar. It's great to make it have a new life again.
What I loved about meeting Rick for the first time was that he loved what he did. He was happy. He didn't make a lot of money. He was lucky that his landlord was giving him a break in Greenwich Village. But he's the guy that decided very early on and said, I want to do what I do on my own terms.
That's the way I feel.
Cindy was like that. And it's
It's you as well, yeah, because you do what you do on your own terms.
Yeah, absolutely. That I could actually make movies without compromise is a privilege, and it's amazing after 40 years of being able to do this, and I'm very lucky to have this, the opportunity to do what I do. And I have so much respect for the arts. Nothing is better than having the subjects of your film tell you that you did a good job. And that's, I don't make films I do make films just to, like I said, for audiences somewhere down in the future, so you can look back and see, oh wow, when Greenwich Village is completely eviscerated from whatever it was, you'd have this movie with Rick Kelly and Cindy, and kind of the last on the corner, before it all sort of falls apart. He makes these guitars from wood that has been cured for 200 years, and so they really sound different and have a tonality. And Rick is, someone who, Lou Reed. He made guitars for Lou Reed, who hung out, and Robert Klein, and it's like Bob Dylan, you know, like Patti Smith. It's just like, really? And here's the thing that I didn't know why people responded so much to Carmine Street Guitars. In fact, I didn't know. I kind of knew this. It's like hanging out in the guitar shop for like a week, and I wanted that experience because I have a fetish for guitars, and wanted to kind of make that, you know, to show that. But it's I asked a friend of mine, like about 6 months after the film, and it was really popular. And I said, "Why is this like, what's going on here?" And people, my friend said that John Lang, he said that Rick is happy in what he does, and and to me, there's a scene in the movie that kind of exemplifies like the whole movie, and that is Cindy is on her bench, Rick is on his bench, and that's it. They're not talking with each other. They're just working, and my friend Len Bloom, who is a writer, and he said that is like his relationship with his partner. They sit on a couch and they don't say anything, and it's pure love. And there's this wonderful relationship that Cindy has with Rick as a mentor, and they're doing what they love in an environment that's nurturing with super cool musicians who walk through the door, and a community. And music is the goal, and music is magic, and they create these magical instruments. These are tools that, create these, it's like Lancelot, with a sword. Like, that's what they're doing. They're creating these incredible magical instruments that are able to keep the world spinning. AI is a way to blend reality with unreality, and somehow but I have to tell you something that is really key to the whole understanding of documentary. There is no truth in cinema and in documentary. It's about perspective. The camera lies. It does not tell the truth. Godard said you have to lie to tell the truth. And we're lying all the time. Even the left and the right.
Yes.
They're lying all the time. And
but the thing is, right now we have a list of forbidden books in schools in Florida.
Well, that's fucked up.
How fucked up is that, man?
Yeah. Well, that's just like, for someone who grew up in the 60s and 70s, that's like, really? Did we not read 1984? Like, what is the problem? Like, it's about legislating morality, and that will fail. It will completely fail. The arc of history bends towards justice, and I just don't. It's like not even worth the time to talk about. It's like so absolutely. It's absurd. What's really worth talking about is the defunding of libraries, or defunding of the arts, and the cost of living that is preventing artists from, creating work. To be honest, I interviewed Jewel Pfeiffer once for Comic Book Confidential, a film about comic books that I made in 1980s. And Jewel Pfeiffer said, in times of repression, there's great art. So look forward for lots of great art.
So you were optimistic.
That's how I'm a positive, hopeful person, completely. And I can tell you one thing that is important, because I made a film called Go Further with activists and with Woody Harrelson, who once said, his guru said, if you look at a mountain it looks like it's not moving. But after time, the mountain moves. I started that film in 2000, and at the turn of the millennium, and there was so much activism, feeling of the change, the world, with young people on campuses especially. And whether it was organic food or just being in Naomi Klein had written "No Logo." There was, an attack on food culture. Sorry, an industrial.
Doing a documentary about Bernie.
About Bernie Sanders?
Bernie Sanders.
Well, I actually went to school in Vermont, and I was thinking of making I went to Bennington College in 1976. It's funny because there's a Ben & Jerry's here, and I was saying, oh yeah, I used to hang out at Ben & Jerry's in Burlington, at the original, Ben. I used to know Ben & Jerry, and I wanted to make a film with Ben, who was all about defunding the peace dividend is what he was all about. Bernie is an amazing subject. I was going to make a film, I forgot his name, but it's about Vermont seceding from the rest of America. And it's awesome. I can't remember it's like Radio Vermont or something. And it's written by the climate change activist who runs 360.org. I've forgotten his name for a minute. But I absolutely understand where Bernie Sanders is coming from, who was, a kind of hero. Where are these people who are, like, there's Bernie, but where are the leaders today who were, like, I grew up with Paul Goodman or Bertrand Russell and who were Abby Hoffman, like they were just being, they were inspiring with solutions and with, whether, I don't know, Alan Watts, whether, or where are Bernie is just an isolated, where are the intellectuals and that need to step up to kind of pull us out of this miasma? And it is these are, you're sitting around a table with your friends and you go, fuck, I don't get it. It's like someone explained to me, like, and I have my own theories, I have theories, of like how we devolved in trust. This is really, and fear has accelerated. And since 9/11, the moment that 9/11 happened, activism went underground.
Like, what's your advice for young filmmaker that wants to follow in your footsteps?
Oh, don't follow my footsteps, man. It's like, I mean, it's like the Suede, you don't want me to give a talk at a college because I'll tell them to drop out of film school. Not Emilio Antonio, but...
you didn't go to film school, by the way.
No, Elia Kazan told me to study everything but film and then make film. So I studied political philosophy and a history of art. And Bellatar just gave a talk about, for, young people. And she said, fucking do it. Like, just, demystify this whole thing. You have a camera, which is your freaking phone. Just go out and do it. Digital, there's no reason. You just have to have something to say. And don't worry about distribution. You just upload it to, YouTube. Just art is what artists do. That's what John Cage said.
Thank you very much. It was an immense pleasure talking to you. I was enlightened. It was a master class. I wish I could keep talking to you for 2 hours.